So welcome everyone. We're so glad to have you with us today, and I know we have several others that will be joining. When we get started, I'd like to make a few introductions. First of all, my name is Deb Powers. I'm honored to be the Executive Director for Leadership Northwest Missouri, and we welcome you today to this video conference. Today's conference is going to be facilitated by Robin Westphal, and Robin is our state librarian for the state of Missouri. So we're excited to have her with us today. And we have two co-presenters today, Isaac Collins, who is a Kansas City leader and a community entrepreneur. And we also have Dr. Tim Crowley. And Tim, many of us know, is a motivational keynote speaker as well as a leadership and resiliency expert. So we are excited to have you all with us today. Before I turn it over to Robin, I'm just going to briefly explain how we came to this point of continuing the conversations. So in January, our Leadership Northwest Missouri 2020 cohort started. We met in January, February, and we all know what happened in March. We were not able to meet in person any longer. So we decided, in order to stay connected with one another, we would convene the class of 2020 twice a month during video chats. And our topics would be relevant leadership topics, relevant to what's going on in our world today. I think you would all agree that a lot has been happening in our nation over the past several months. So some of the biggest challenges we've seen, challenges that are evolving around us daily, transpire around the Black Lives Matter movement. So as leaders, we realize it's really important for us to engage and to educate one another and to empower each of us to have a voice. So during our June class of 2020 video chat, we invited Isaac Collins to join us, and we had conversations around diversity and inclusion. Well, I will tell you that that was very well received. We had many class members that enjoyed that conversation. And as a result of that, we decided, well, we have almost 400 alumni of the Leadership Northwest Missouri program. Why don't we open this conversation up to alumni, which we did. That day, Robin Westphal, who is an alum of Leadership Northwest class of 2013, Robin was involved that day in the conversations, and afterward she contacted me and said, hey, why don't we do more of these, but let's do it on book discussions. Let's see what interest we might be able to get. So Robin started that movement. We got Tim and Isaac on board. So here we are today, ready to dive into a discussion around the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Again, we're really happy to have all of you here with us today. And Robin, I want to thank you for your insight and for stepping up to facilitate our conversation today.
Well, and I have to say, maybe it's a little self-serving that I want to showcase what librarians do and how we very much want to be a part of the conversation and maybe what special skills we have that would lend itself to these really tough conversations. I mean, yeah, I like to do book discussions on The Help, or I'm trying to think of some of my favorites. I got two of my book group folks online as well, but those are fun, and actually there's a lot that can come out of those. But it's important that we also are involved in these sorts of conversations as well. And Deb, I think you did a great job of talking about what brought us here and why that meeting that we had earlier was so inspirational and kind of prompted me to say, we got to do more. We've got to continue the conversation. So out of that, the Continue the Conversation crew was created, and we've been working, I don't know, last month or so, I would say, crew, on this and trying to perfect it. It's not going to be perfect, but we're trying to make this something that there was some value in it for you, and maybe something that you can take back to your folks. I do want to begin by saying, I think a lot of you probably haven't had the opportunity to read the book. In fact, there are some of you I asked just this morning if you wanted to join us, and we completely understand that, and that is not necessary, in particular for this book, that you would have read the book. I bet a lot of you have heard of it, or a similar book that's come out recently on this topic. This is a very accessible book. It's easy to read. It's easy to get into. And so I encourage you to check it out at your local library, or purchase it. And there's many different ways you can purchase this title. But I encourage you that after this, that you do invest in reading the book or listening to the book. I want to begin by talking about some of the ground rules that we laid out. And really, I see these ground rules as being essential for any conversation, not just a book discussion. So one of the things that we're giving you is the ground rules, and I think it's something that you can just use in your everyday life. And you have them, so it's going to be really brief to go over them. So we all want to strive for intellectual humility. We're going to talk a little bit about vulnerability and what it means to be vulnerable and humble. So I hope that during this conversation, you think about that as being something that you want to gain from this. Recognize the difference between opinion and informed knowledge. I wish I could put that on my social media. Maybe that's going to become my canned comment to a lot of folks and some of the posts that aggravate me. Maybe recognize the difference between opinions and informed knowledge. Let go of personal anecdotal evidence and look at broader societal patterns. So, of course, what's going on in your world and the stories that you have are important, but they don't always tell the whole story. And then notice your own defensive reactions and attempt to use these reactions as entry points for gaining deeper self-knowledge. You think about, what is it that makes me defensive when we're talking about this topic? What is it that makes me, as a white, middle-aged, Midwestern woman, that might make me defensive and get my back up a little bit? Notice that. I think it's important that we all notice that and use that reaction. Why am I reacting that way? As a way to really dig deeper into the things that we're talking about. Recognize your own social positionality, my race, my gender, my class, and how that has informed my perspectives and reactions. So think about that. Where I'm coming from is completely different than what Ibram would have been coming from when he wrote this book. How we're going to do this is we are going to, the four of us are going to remain unmuted. And I think Deb is probably muted everyone else right now. And we are really going to have some back and forth discussion around some very timely and particular questions. And then we're going to open it up for questions at the end. But the one thing we do encourage is we want you to use the chat. Chat amongst each other, chat your opinions on some of the things we're talking about. We will be looking at that and monitoring that, of course, but we really encourage you to converse with each other by using chat. And again, we will open this up for your questions because we do want to hear from you, but that'll be at the end. We want to keep this moving, and part of that is to allow for those questions to be at the end. So as we're going along, as we are sort of answering the discussion questions, if you have things you want to add, jot those down, and then we'll make sure and try to get to you at the end as we go over that. So Tim and Isaac and Deb, are we ready to go? Have I covered everything that I needed to cover?
You got it.
Yeah,
okay.
you got it.
Okay. Isaac, I'm gonna start with you. At the beginning of the book, the foreword of the book, right at the beginning, Dr. Kendi shares his own experience with his own racist thinking. And how do you think that his honesty about that gives us the space to acknowledge our own racist behaviors and ideas?
Yeah, it's a good question, Robin. First off, thanks for having me, guys. I'm curious for the ones that are here, before I answer that question, can you just give me a quick hand raise if you've read the book, a little bit of it, all of it? Okay, a couple. Good, good. So yeah, great question. I think we start out by defining the word racism first, so we kind of all understand what it is. I think especially now, since George Floyd's murder, there's a lot of different definitions floating around and information and whatnot. So if you do a little Google search, it just says the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, qualities, which distinguishes them as inferior or superior. So one race is superior to another, based off of a belief or something like that. So kind of obvious, but sometimes we leave out the one race superior over another. I loved how he opened this up because I think, at least for me, he really put down my wall of my experience as a Black man. And I've heard the same thing. My wife is white, and she had the same experience when he first started his first story about expressing his own racism and his own racist bias that he has actually as a Black man against his own community, against Black people, going against that same stereotype that you may hear of, Black people are this or that. And he gave it in reference to essentially a speech that he was giving. And in that, he was talking about the plight of the Black community, but in his rhetoric, what he was saying, he was really reinforcing a lot of the things that you may hear as talking points to kind of use as racist comments towards the Black community. So that was really cool for me to hear. And just to be honest with you guys, especially the ones that I know, I am from Kansas City, but I grew up in St. Joe and I went to Savannah School District. So all of my friends, all my peers were white. I was in a school of almost 800 people, and there's only one other Black person there. And I actually found myself believing those same things about myself or the Black community, and saying those same things either about myself or about my Black family and my Black friends. And so it actually was cool because I got a chance to not come at this as, okay, what can I learn to teach others? But I just strictly stopped at, what can I learn? And it was really, really cool. I loved it. So
yeah, I think as you all begin to read this book, I think that was sort of a surprising beginning for us. I think when you pick it up, you're thinking, okay, this is going to be about teaching me what I've been doing wrong, or why my behavior, how I can change my behavior. But to hear Kendi right at the beginning talk about how, like you said, he himself, as a young Black man, realized that he had his own biases and prejudices against his own race. And for him to acknowledge that, I'm talking again as my white middle-aged woman from rural Missouri, actually put me at ease, Isaac, to hear that. And so I appreciate that that's how this started. So it's like, okay, I know where he's coming from. He's made me feel at ease right from the beginning. And so, Tim, that leads into what it means to be vulnerable. That right at the beginning, when I picked up the book, I knew that I had my own vulnerabilities. And one of the things that you really talked with us a lot about in Leadership Northwest was what it means to be a leader and what it means to show your own vulnerability. So why do you think that we need to approach this anti-racism work with an inclusion of vulnerability?
Robin, thanks for that question. Before I answer it, I just want to say hi to everybody. I see so many familiar faces, and I want to say this to the folks that I recognize and those that I don't, but I just want to say thank you for taking time out of your day, taking time out of your life. Thank you for showing up, not just here, but I'm sure in the way that you show up in all the arenas of your life. So I believe that we're all leaders. I believe that leadership is about impact and influence. I believe leaders are learners and learners are leaders. So thank you for being here. I think what's helped me to be a better learner and a better leader is to be vulnerable. And I'll bet, as most of you, when you think of the leaders in your life that you look up to, the men and women, they're people that can admit their mistakes. There are people that can be vulnerable enough to ask for help. They can share when things are wrong. What happens when we as leaders can demonstrate our vulnerability, it makes us human and it makes us approachable. And then two things happen. Connections happen, trust happens, and usually people are much, much more engaged. So today I'm going to encourage all of us to lean in and to be vulnerable, to learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable, to get out of our comfort zone, and to know that we're all in this for one reason, which is to help make the world better for everybody. So I don't know how you do that without being vulnerable. If we're not vulnerable, we're not authentic, and children and dogs and people can smell that pretty quickly. So anyway, we couldn't do this work without all of you being here. So thanks for saying yes. And we're really looking forward to, for the most part, you're going to hear from Kendi. We're just going to share Kendi's thoughts today, and then we're going to leave time at the end for some Q&A, and we want to hear your thoughts and opinions and comments. So thank you.
Yep.
Here we go. We're leaning in.
Here we go. Yep. So in this book, this is for both Isaac and Tim, there's a lot of new concepts. Anti-racism is probably a concept. I mean, I understand anti and I understand racism. You put them together, I get what you come up with. But that as a term was not something that I had heard. There's also really a rethinking, I would say a rethinking of concepts that we have heard as segregationist and assimilationist. Can you talk to Isaac, and then maybe Tim can chime in too? What is it? Why are those terms so important? And how, in reading this book, have you thought about the old terms differently? And how have you thought about this new term, anti-racist?
Yeah.
Isaac, I'm going to ask if I can go first because I think I can set you up better.
Sure. Love it. Love a good setup, Tim.
Yeah, so once again, this is coming from Kendi's book. So, like, part of being a leader is not just learning, but it's also unlearning. So, like, the word racist, so there's two words I want to speak to. The first word is racist. The second word is anti-racist. So, my idea of racist, and I'm not sure what yours is, but I'll ask you right now. Right now, what is your idea of racist? What's your definition of that? Mine, prior to reading Kendi's work, was that racist usually was somebody that was intentionally being hateful, discriminating, choosing to treat people in a way that says that one race is better than another's. And for the most part, it's intentional. And if it's not intentional, I can't believe I used to say this, I would think thoughts like, well, it's just ignorance. People don't know better. And typically we think if people know better, they will do better. So I thought it was very much about individual behavior of men and women throughout the country, throughout the world. I don't think that at all now. So when I think of the word racist has a lot less to do with individual people and their behavior and their actions, and it has a whole lot to do with policy. And it's, so this is Kendi's definition, I'm paraphrasing, but any human being that supports a policy or practices that discriminate against any people, that take away from justice and freedom from any people, that would be racist. And so it's really making me pause in my life, pay attention to, even like we got an election next week, I'm going to pay attention in the voting booth, and I'm going to look at those policies, and if they discriminate against people, Kendi doesn't spare words. If they discriminate against people, they are racist. And so in that voting booth, I'll have a decision to make on how I want to show up. So along with that, we'll talk a little bit more about this. I used to think the opposite of racist means I'm not racist. And Robin's got a question for you, but Kendi says the opposite of racist is not I'm not racist. And we're going to talk more about that in a few moments. But the opposite of it is, and I've never heard of it until I picked up his book and began to read it, is Antiracist. By the way, Robin said this is an easy book for her, so it shows you that librarians are smarter than I am. This for me it's part law, it's part ethic, it's lots of history, and then what's beautiful about it, it has his personal story and memoir just weaved in and out from the very beginning to the very end of this book. So
hey, Ted, I'm trying to sell it to them. It's something that they can, that they're gonna want to read.
And I think they will. This is how I read it. Boy, I had to pick it up and I would read, sometimes not even a chapter. And I would have to sit it down and absorb it and think about it, have conversations with friends and family, and usually ask my son to explain what words meant to me. And then I would pick it back up again. And then I also listened to him on Audible. So, but boy, this really is a vision how all of us can become anti-racist. And to be anti-racist simply means this. It means as individuals, we will support policies and practices that embrace all of humanity, that embrace all people, that embrace justice and freedom for all people. And so what it does, it takes the shift off individual differences. By the way, if we could change individual people, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It would be a done deal. But you know what's powerful is, with his new defining of this, we can all work together and collectively to look at policies and decide if they're racist or not, and then to be able to change them. And we all can, every day of our lives, work towards becoming more anti-racist. And that's what the rest of this talk will do. We're going to flesh out ways that you all can learn to be more anti-racist. So those are my 2 words. Isaac?
Yeah, I love that. I have to agree on that. Robin, I love you to death. This was I don't want to say a hard read, but I mean, you'll have to dive into this thing. There's a lot of law, a lot of history, a lot of personal anecdotes and stories that made it really, I don't want to say more palatable, but kept you sucked in. But I was the same as Tim. I literally had to listen to a section, put it down. Sometimes I would just walk around just to kind of like understand. I would talk to Tim about it just so I can kind of dive in. And so that kind of feeds in to my words. That actually is a good setup after he talked about racist versus anti-racist. And the 2 other words that he discussed, I believe in chapter 2, maybe, or maybe in chapter 1, it was really close to the beginning. He's like, okay, well, we have 3 ways that we can go about this and that we can be in this movement for equality and to be, you know, the opposite of racist. And there's 3 kind of camps. Anti-racist is one, and the other 2 were words that I kind of just learned and really made it make more sense to me in my mind. The other 2 were assimilationist and segregationist. And it was cool to be able to put definitions to that and also have backing of history to say, okay, who was kind of in what camp, what philosophies do those bring, and how do those come about to modern day today? And so assimilationist is one who is expressing the racist idea that a racial group is culturally or behaviorally inferior and is supporting cultural or behavioral enrichment programs to develop that racial group. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I'll just go into segregationist real quick. Segregationist, that one's probably a little bit easier for us to understand. It's one who is expressing the racist idea that a permanently inferior racial group can never be developed and is supporting the policy that segregates or separates us as racial groups. And that's played out a lot in our history. And unfortunately, it plays out with us today as well. So assimilationist, this thought of, you know, one group is above another, so the group that's below needs to aspire to be like the group that's up here. And that can be done by the superior group trying to make everyone else like them, but it also happens in members of the groups that are inferior trying to convince the rest of the community that they need to aspire to be different than they actually are. And so that notion is birthed from discrimination. And what it brings forward in this conversation is that Black people are to blame for the inequalities that happen to them because of the discrimination that happens. So for me, I have actually a little story about that. Again, went to Savannah. I was one of 2 Black people at the whole school. And so I went there from 4th grade all the way up to graduating 12th grade. And it's not like anyone's like, I'm an assimilationist, this is what I'm going to do to get everyone to believe me. It is really ingrained in our culture, so it naturally just happens through verbals and nonverbals, but also I did it a lot to myself as well, just being in around the community. And so it happens in, how can I fit in more? Well, everyone else gets along, so what am I doing that isn't like what everyone else is doing? Well, I talk different, I dress different, I listen to different music, I speak differently, etc. I like different things, I wear different things to smell good, that kind of stuff. Well, if those things are setting me apart, let me do the things that my friends are doing so I can fit in. And it happens, that's one way of looking at it from the perspective of a Black person trying to fit in, but it also goes the other way. With segregationists, I don't know if you guys know who J.C. Nichols is. I see a couple head nods. So in Kansas City, he's very known for being a developer, real estate developer, essentially. He built a lot of the Country Club Plaza and Mission and Fairway and a lot of the nicer places that we know in Kansas City. And so a couple of things that happened there as far as being a segregationist in the 20s, he developed areas and he created deeds that said certain racial groups can't be in this area. And that's called, redlining is a form of that. And so if you actually look and research Kansas City actually right here in the heartland of the United States is very segregated, where you see the majority of African Americans are east of Truce, which is called like the Truce Wall. And, that happens also when you look at a majority of white population being in suburbs. And so if you see a white person in the ghetto or the hood, it's weird. If you see a majority, a Black person go to the suburbs or live there, it's weird. You may think like, oh, that's different, but then it's fine. It kind of goes away. That's where that's kind of birthed from a little bit. And being from Kansas City, I've kind of known those things, but actually digging deeper and finding out a little more about the backstory of J.C. Nichols was really like informational and educational for me. And so those are 2 things that I loved how he kind of plays that out. And so we can have these philosophies where we fall into one camp, but then as we go forward on that, we can find ways to get out of the ideology of being an assimilationist and how we can rebuke those as we travel along the path to becoming an anti-racist and supporting anti-racist ideologies and also policies. So that was really cool for me. I actually called my dad and talked to him about a lot of those things. And he's like, yep, here's how it has played out in my lifetime. So it was like another learning lesson for my pops.
Yep. Excellent. Excellent. So one of the things that Kendi says is the only way to undo racism is to constantly identify it, describe it, and dismantle it. So one of the things I came away from in this book is that there have obviously in my life some things that I have done or said that have been racist. And now I realize that I need to be called out for that when that happens. But I need to not necessarily think of racist as a bad word. Isaac and Tim, we all have racist things that we have done or said, and obviously some anti-racist things that we have done and said. Why is it that we need to maybe not think of the word racist as a bad word? Do you think it's important to call out ourselves and others when we see or say racist things?
Isaac, you got it? Want me to go?
I'll go first. So I love in this book, Kendi talks multiple times about this word, racist, and how oftentimes we look at the word racist in a very offensive way. Like, we never want to be called racist. And a lot of times we look at it like it's, I think he uses the word pejorative, which I actually had to ask your son, Nick, one of my best friends as well, because he's so smart. And as I was kind of like learning what that was, like, we look at that word as if it is like a slur towards us. Like, we don't want to be in the camp of that. Well, he kind of debunks that in a really cool teaching way, in saying, you know, and we're going to talk about this later, but in one moment we can be anti-racist, in another moment we can in fact be racist. Everyone can. And so that was really cool to know that. So I think it's important to call out racism. I do a lot of these, and what I found is a majority of people are just trying to get this thing right. They don't understand. And that's the importance of continuing the conversation. So if we're not having these conversations and we're not calling each other out, then how do we learn?
Yep.
And how do we seek different perspectives on things? And so I think that's the importance of it. And it's, you know, one conversation at a time, where we can really get rid of the racist parts of ourselves and seek to be anti-racist. And again, we're not going to be perfect at this. It's actually impossible, because again, one moment you can be racist, the next be anti-racist. But having these conversations and continually learning as leaders in our community, in our workplace, we're dedicated to learning forever. This is another portion that we can learn, along with, you know, how to be a better leader. This actually goes into our leadership as well.
And I think, and Tam, I'm going to, because the next question after that is very similar, and I think you'll be able to answer that as well. But I'd like to ask everyone the question. We can either do it as a show of hands. Somewhere here in Zoom, there's the little itty bitty hand that you can hit, and you can raise your hand as well if you want to do that. But how many have you actually, especially just think about since George Floyd and some of the other things that have gone on, and your response to it, that anger you felt, and you say, I am not a racist, or I am colorblind, I don't see color. And that was one thing I picked up on in the last conversation we had. There was a lot of that I am colorblind, I don't see color, or I am not a racist. Isn't there more constructive language that we can use that shows that we support the ideals identified with not being racist? Isn't there a different way of saying that? I support Black Lives Matter. Isn't there a better way of saying I am not a racist to support those ideals that go along with Black Lives Matter?
I have an easy answer for that. The answer is a resounding yes, and it's beginning to say I'm anti-racist, knowing that you can't be one or the other. You can't be not racist. It really doesn't exist. But as Isaac said, being a racist and anti-racist, we used to think that it was just like static. You either were or you weren't, but it's dynamic. So that can go back and forth within weeks, months, within a day. You can demonstrate anti-racist behaviors are racist behaviors. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so really what Kendi's encouraging all of us to do, if we decide to say yes to this journey, is to, I'll sum it up this way. We know how to be racist. We've got that down as Americans, unfortunately. We know how not to be not racist. What he wants us to do and encourages us to do is to learn what it means to be anti-racist. And remember, with racists, usually, kind of what Isaac was speaking about this, when you use that word and you deliver that word to somebody, it usually means like bad people. Nobody wants that. But when we start thinking of anti-racist, that's bad policy. And we can get behind bad policies and changing bad policies. And if we don't do this different, we'll continue to have what we've had over the last 51 years since Martin Luther King's death. So this is about a new insight, a new way of beginning to look at ourselves differently, which you got to be self-critical, and you got to ask yourself, what do you contribute to that's racist, and how can you every day strive to be more anti-racist? And we'll flesh out ideas of what we all can do individually and collectively as we move through this conversation.
Isaac, did you want to add anything to that?
Honestly, he nailed it as far as what I was thinking and going to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, Tim, you touched on really what our next topic is going to be, and it's about policy. And again, a lot of this book is about policy. And I had my light bulb moment when we were preparing for this, and thought about policies that I've been involved in. So in addition to being a state librarian, I've been a library director. I've served on the school board. Like probably a lot of you, I've been involved in different boards and community activities along the way where we've had the opportunity to make policy or to enforce policy. And it really got me thinking about some of the policies that I've been involved in. In particular, I was thinking about the library policy, what I can say about, for sure about Chillicothe, just because I know the library there, because I was there for as long as I was. We have a policy of not charging overdue fines or overdue fees, and it has become a passion of mine, that I don't think libraries should have overdue fines and fees for when your book is late, and I'll tell you why. That policy to me has always been about punishing, and really what it's doing is it's punishing those who, for whatever reason, it could be transportation, could be a reason, it could be massive amount of stuff going on in your life, beyond the fact that you're reading, that is preventing you from getting your materials returned to the library. And I've always felt that it was a discriminatory policy. And it wasn't until we were reading this that I really thought about what I think something that libraries could do to be anti-racist would truly be to get rid of that policy. It is a fact that it's in particular in urban library settings that there's a disproportionate amount of folks who have overdue fines, and then once you get the fine, you're not using the library because they restrict your usage because of the fines, and the majority of those are in the lower socioeconomic areas, and so that's where the fines are sort of the massive amount of fines. A lot of that is coming from those groups. So if you can't pay your library fine, then you're done using the library. And so that is a policy. That is something that now, as I talk more about it, and I talk about it all the time, in fact, probably the library directors in Missouri are tired of hearing me talk about it. I can talk about this as being something that they could think about completely different, about thinking about how this would truly be an anti-racist policies. So thinking about that, can we talk about why it does seem that there is a disproportionate amount of attention paid to individual acts of racism rather than examining these institutional racism and the policies that go along with that? So Tim or Isaac, would either one of you want to address that, or any policies in particular that seem to be disproportionately or aimed toward the Black community, or overtly or not overtly racist?
Yeah, I think that one thing that I hear when I talk to people about this concept of policies being racist, the thing that I hear is like, how can a policy be racist? Like, it's not a person. And we have this thought process of like, people are racist, not anything else. And that's just unfortunately not true. So I think it's easier to attack people on this concept of, people are racist and that's just their ideology and it is what it is, when I think this book really kind of debunks the fact that you can stamp someone as like racist. Like, racist, you can't get rid of that. It sticks with you because there are there's misinformation, there are flaws. I think there's a big thing of, and I talk about this a lot, that oftentimes we stick with the talking points of our political affiliation, and we sometimes believe those things, maybe because that's the only source of news that we're getting, without knowing what those thoughts are actually doing, how it makes another group feel, or how those policies affect another group. When in fact, Kendi talks about, then that's the point of the whole book, of becoming an anti-racist, but focusing more on fixing the policies. And so just like we're saying a person can't be non-racist, they're either racist or anti-racist, a policy is the same thing. A racist policy is anything that doesn't support, that marginalizes and puts down a group. And so then on the flip side of that, an anti-racist one is one that's still fair to all people, but doesn't marginalize a community just based off of their race. The one that comes up to me is just what's going around the prison system, mass incarcerations. And my dad's been a warden of a prison for 20, 25 years. And so we have a lot of conversations about prison system in general. I feel like I know way too much about that than I really want to. But, you know, there are a lot of policies that marginalize and keep minority communities down, and that have happened over the last really 60 years as we go from slavery to Jim Crow to kind of like civil rights times into what's happened with mass incarceration, and a couple policies and bills that got passed by Republican and Democratic presidents that have fed into that, that have been very racist policies that have helped with mass incarceration that I'm not sure the exact numbers, and Tim, maybe you do, but I believe I was reading somewhere the other day that 2 times Black men and women are 2 times more likely to get thrown in prison than white. And the fact that the Black community is only 13% of the population, but we account for over 60% of the prison population. And there's a lot more there that can go along with that, but that's one that's very prevalent in the community, in the fact of you can get labeled as a felon, and then at that point your life is kind of over. You can't really get a job, and it just makes it really, really hard, which in my opinion, I think that needs to be re-examined as a policy that's tough for any person, white, Black, whoever, who's a felon. So there's a lot of those that go into it. And I think another big thing we need to really look at is, you know, are we talking something, actually I'll save that because I have a better part for that in a later question. That'll hit home a little bit better. But Tim, what do you got?
Oh, I'm just listening to all sorts of different examples popping up in my mind. So there's men and women of all colors in prison for, once they came up with that law, 3 strikes. And so there's men and women who are spending 10, 20, 30 years in prison plus, with no option for parole for violation of marijuana, which in many states today is legal. And there's people, predominantly white men, who have murdered people and spend less time in prison. So there's a policy that we better take a look at and begin to figure out how to make that, bring more equality to that policy. Another example of a policy, and I don't want to be political, but policies have a lot to do with politics. So next week, there's going to be on the poll, and you vote where you choose to, but whether we should expand Medicaid. And so if we don't expand Medicaid, we're discriminating against the people probably that need it most. And so those are just other examples. And so what Kendi wants us to do is to take our energy away from changing people, which lots of luck, and the 500 and some years since slavery began, that's not work. But when we can begin to look at policies, we can change those. I actually have a quote of his, and I typically don't read things, but his words are much more fluent than mine. And he talks about how to be an anti-racist. And he says, to be an anti-racist is to think nothing is behaviorally wrong or right. How about that one right there? Inferior or superior with any of the racial groups. Whenever the anti-racist, that's all of you, that's me, when we see individuals behaving positively or negatively, the anti-racist is exactly that, individuals behaving positively or negatively, not representatives of whole races. How many times do we stereotype one behavior to all races, whether it's Black, Asian, white? We do that all the time. So to be an anti-racist is to de-racialize behavior, to remove the tattooed stereotype from every racialized body, Behavior is something humans do, not races do. And that's where he really says, then we need to begin to think about what it means to be an anti-racist. And our greatest hope for the future is to begin to look at policies. And as policies change, he says people's behaviors will change and will follow.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. Behavior is something that individuals do, not racists.
Yeah, how about
That's powerful. It's that behavior. And this is what we hope from the thinking of our educators. This is what we hope is the thinking of should be our politicians. It should be all of those who are in a position to implement or create policy, that they're thinking about behavior as something that individuals do. That's powerful.
You know, Robin, another example. So we all know with George Floyd, and it's easy to make about Black people against law enforcement. That's not what the people of Black Lives Matters are saying. We know there's good law enforcement. Many of us have friends and family members that are law enforcement of all races. So it's not that law enforcement is bad. That's what a racist person would want you to do. They'd want you to get in that conversation. We know better. We know that was the individual behavior of that person.
Yep.
But when we look at the policies and Minneapolis, they've already changed that. You can't do that type of chokehold on, police are no longer allowed to do that. I think they're going to save lives. So that was an example already of an anti-racist policy put in place.
Mm-hmm. Wow, and now we're really switching gears. But this is important, but important in a different way. Kendi changed his middle name from Henry, so his given middle name was Henry, to Zolani, which means peace in Zulu. And he changed his last name from Rogers to Kendi when he got married. They chose their new name together. He and his wife chose their new name together, and they unveiled that new last name of Kendi, which means loved one. So when they got married, they unveiled that to their family and their friends at their wedding. There's more to it, though, than that. Kendi wanted to get away from the name Henry for a very particular reason. And it has to do with the fact that name is derived from Prince Henry of Portugal, who was part of the slave trade and very, very much had racist ideals. Why do you think it's important that Kendi talked about this in the book? What do you think is the significance of telling us the story of why he changed his name? I'm kind of throwing you guys to that one because I'm not sure.
Yeah. That's definitely a.
So not only was Prince Henry, actually he was the first person who defined races. So really, racism is this may sound weird, but it's less than 600 years old. Prior to 600 years ago, and Prince Henry, we did not have race. So he's the individual who first started classifying people based upon pigment in their skin, on skin color. He was the first slave trader, slave owner. So he's the person who started all of this. And there were statues made to honor him for doing that very thing. So then moving along, like with Ibram's father, on his grandfather's name was Henry, and so that's where Ibram's middle name came from. But he was a slave. Ibram's father didn't know that Henry and where that name originally originated from. That Portugal is where the slave trade industry began. And so what I love about Kendi, he's a person of action. So upon discovering that and having that insight and that awareness, I'm sure that was not easy to give up his middle name. Matter of fact, his father picked that name and chose it after his grandfather who was a slave. Kendi has an older sibling, and his mom got to pick that middle name, so his dad got to pick one. It wasn't easy for Kendi to do that, but what I love about this guy, he does the hard work. He takes action where most of us find some way to go along with it. So not only did he change that, but you mentioned what he changed it to, and I'm not sure. How do you say his middle name? How do you pronounce it, Robin?
I don't know. I said Zolani.
Yeah. And so to go from slave trade, or the origination of slave, and he chose peace. It's a Zulu word from South Africa. And then for him and his wife to take on the name of the loved one. And so I think there's power in words. I think there's power in naming words. And so he put action behind something, and inspires me to do the same, and hopefully inspires all of us to put action behind our leadership, and action behind our learning, and action behind our conversation. So
Excellent. Excellent. Isaac, this one is for you in particular. Kendi talks about when he first became aware of his own racial identity. So if you would like to touch on that story just a little bit for our audience. And then I'm curious as to how you, first being from Kansas City, living in St. Joe and then Savannah, how you first became aware of your own racial identity.
Yeah, good question. So I love Kendi's story about this. So the backstory, if you guys haven't read the book, for what happened to him was they're living in New York, and he went to a school that he felt very comfortable with in first and second grade, and then he had to go to another school. So they were kind of trying to find a good school that fit in, and there's a lot more story to it based off of his parents' ideology and philosophy between going from anti-racist actually backwards to assimilationist that you can read, and it's a very good read in there that he covers in the beginning. But they go to do the walkthrough at the school. He's with his parents, and they actually, when they're walking up, they get met by the teacher. Teacher happens to be Black, and so they walk into the school, and they're in there talking and whatnot. And so Kendi asks the teacher, "Are you the only Black teacher?" And she says yes. And right away he was like, "Why are you the only Black teacher?" And she like looks at his parents, and essentially they were just like, he's been reading a lot about the Black experience and people who have come before him. And I think it was his mom that said like, he's aware now that he's Black. And the teacher was stunned, was very surprised. And as I was kind of thinking about that and doing my writing, I was thinking, why was that teacher so surprised at that? Obviously that's very jarring, but I think that she was more surprised the fact that he was having those questions as a 7-year-old. We don't really start to see race and also be as confident as he was to speak on it at the age of 7. And so obviously Kendi's just a different human. His whole mindset is he's a really, really cool guy, and really well read as well. But he said in the book, he's like, at 7 years old was when I discovered race, and my race is Black. And so that was really interesting. And so, and he talks later about like race being a mirage, because it's like, like Tim was saying, a little less than 600 years ago, race wasn't really a thing. We were just people. There wasn't Black, there wasn't white, there wasn't all of this. But when Prince Henry and his team started to create the narrative, actually it was his essentially like documenter that was putting the writings together to tell the story of Prince Henry. They wanted to do it in a way to prop him up on a pedestal to show, hey, what he did was actually honored and it was okay. And he did that by creating a racial hierarchy there of Black, white, and everything in between. And that was just really, really interesting when you look at that. And so for him, he found out what race was at 7 years old. And I say it's a mirage because it's not really a thing, but if you believe it's a thing, it's a thing. So it's kind of fleeting in that way. And so for me, going through being in Kansas City, predominantly around, my family who's Black, living downtown St. Joe, which was pretty mixed. There was I would say it fell in line with the normal population of the US. And then going to Savannah was a culture shock. But when I first got there, I still didn't see like color in that way. Still didn't like, hey, I'm black. Until 3rd and 4th grade, when I was 8 or 9, things started happening to me that I was confused about. I had, seen and heard different things in my community, but I had never had those things said to me by someone who wasn't my color, and that happened to me very quickly. And so when I was going home and I was talking to my parents about it, that's when I had those conversations about this same stuff that Kendi had read in the books, to learn the hierarchy and the backstory about racism, about what it means to be black, actually why I'm different or looked at as different. And it was really, I would say, jarring to hear the differences, because I was in 3rd or 4th grade, just want to play some basketball, but it was also cool to be able to learn that history as well. So I think that's why it was so stunning to learn that at such a young age, but an important lesson for him to learn, especially if he was going to go to a school that was like varying in race like that.
Yep, excellent. Many people think that, and this we've heard this so much, especially recently, that racism will go away if we stop focusing on race and stop talking about race. I mean, this is the whole Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. And both of you, and Tim, I'll start with you. Why do you think ignoring or minimizing racist acts and behavior is not enough? Why is it not good enough to say, let's stop focusing on race and let's stop talking about it? Why is ignoring racist acts and behavior not enough?
Think about that statement for a moment. Just think about that. When have we ever in history, our contemporary times, ever solved anything by ignoring it? So with COVID, let's not pay attention to anything. Let's not pay attention to it. That's not the answer. So whether it's in business, politics, sports, when it's concerned with our health or relationships, the worst thing we can do is to ignore. And we always know the stuff that get ignored usually gets exacerbated and intensified. And I think that's what's happened, because we haven't done the work around racism or to be anti-racist. I think it's not a surprise of what's going on in the world today. But I mean, it's like, think of cancer, and you or a loved one or somebody has cancer, and they're just going to ignore it. They're not going to go to the doctor. They're just going to get through this. And if they talk about it, they're just going to get sicker. That sounds ridiculous, right? And yet we apply that to race.
But what seems to happen, what seems to be the logical thing that happens, is that it takes an event like the death of George Floyd, or it takes something. And once we've seen that event, I'm kind of going off script, guys. Once we've seen that event, and then we see other events that have happened since then, all of a sudden it's like we've woken up, as opposed to being awake and needing to address these topics all along. So and we'll talk maybe about this when it comes to action steps, but just like with everything, we're going to get to the point where George Floyd's death is going to be so much in the past, and in 2020, so much in the past is 6 months as opposed to year. Everything moves so much quicker. We're going to get to where that's not even discussed anymore. And so we're going to take our foot off the pedal, and we're going to go back to just sort of ignoring that there ever was a problem.
I'm going to say, let's not do that. I'm going to say,
okay, but we'll leave it at let's not do that, because certainly that does seem to be like, to be perfectly honest, that's part of the reason why we're having this conversation.
I think that's what happens historically. Even look like at 9/11. After that happened, before that, New Yorkers didn't like each other. After that, they all came together, but it wasn't long, and then things kind of go back. But in my observations, and I'll be curious when we get into the Q&A and where the audience can share their comments and observations as well. So I really want to hear from you. there's something different this time. Like even if you look throughout history and you pull up videos and footage, typically with most of civil rights, it's mostly, what do you see when you pull that up? It's mostly Black people with Black people. And this is like worldwide, and I see races, and I see in some urban areas and cities where, or even out in rural areas where there are not as many Black people or people of color. I see a lot of white people come together. There's something happening now that, and I don't know what it is, and I almost think COVID has something to do with it. We're living in a time of so much uncertainty.
Yeah.
And as much as our lives are still busy, we have an opportunity to reflect and pay attention. And I think we've hit a tipping point. And the very fact that today we put an invitation out and here's all these people, we're all wanting to share and to learn and to grow. Something is happening different in me, and I believe in all of you. And so we're all working together to move this conversation forward so that we all become more anti-racist. Something powerful is happening, I believe, in the nation and in the world.
Yeah.
Not with everybody, but there's a core group of people that are showing up in ways they have not done before.
Yep, including 50 or so, some, from rural, most of y'all from, rural Missouri. So, Tim, I'm back at you because you do a lot of diversity training with organizations and businesses. And Kendi talks a lot about the word microaggression. And you admitted that that's something that you use when you're doing your diversity training. How have you been impacted by his definition of that word? You're probably going to have to define it probably for the group. And why is it changing how you're now going to do diversity training?
So you talk about a paradigm shift. Like I thought I was a white guy who got it. Matter of fact, I have a Black mentor and friend, Rudy Nickens, who often introduces me when we do those trainings, and he'll say, "This is a white guy that gets it." Oh, I so didn't get it. And so I can't wait to have a conversation about Rudy. So words like, which most of us on this Zoom call, I'm going to guess, we're familiar with conscious bias and implicit bias and microaggressions and micro inequities. He says those are just all really safe words to have a conversation, and in his that we wouldn't have otherwise. And I think it's helped, but his concern is it's kind of similar to that thinking of like, why do we talk about Black issues? It just makes them worse. It's kind of that same thinking, using these words to me, and after listening, it just waters down what it is. He says we need to call it, say it like we see it, and if we see racist policies, say they're racist policies. If we see policies that discriminate against women, say we see policies that discriminate against women. If we see policies that discriminate against race, gender, that we need to start saying it and use the word racist. And in a few moments, Isaac's going to share a lot of the different types of racisms. In fact, he covers so many in his book that we won't have time to go through them, but it's a few of my thoughts there.
And Tim, we all want to, next time you're doing just straight up diversity training, make sure we all get an invite so we can sit in on that and we can correct you as we need to, and we'll call you out if
promise, do it. We're all in this together.
We are all in this together. And so that was a good lead-in, Isaac, because Tim talked about the different types of racism. Kendi talks in this book about biological and ethnic and bodily and cultural racism. Can you speak to these different types? And I'm being conscious of the time as we continue through that. But can you speak to these different types and talk to us either about what you've experienced and the reality that if we truly are going to live an anti-racist life, why we must stand against all forms of racism?
Yeah, that's good. Well, first off, Tim, I do think that you get it way more than you give yourself credit for. So I will say that. I've known you since I was in middle school, and you've never said a microaggression or anything, any racist things towards me on accident or anything. And even in our conversations, I still learn so much from you. So if you guys don't know, his son's one of my best friends, and he's like another dad to me. So I've known Tim for a very, very long time. But great question, Robin. There are a lot of different kinds of racism. And I think that the four of us have been just blown away reading this book over the last couple weeks, because he goes so in depth on different things that I didn't even know existed. And so I don't know if he invented, these isms or what, but he put a name to them and kind of a voice to them. And it was really cool to be able to look at something and hear different kinds of racism and like how they manifest in our lives, in policies, in whatever it is. And there's so many of them that you definitely need to read this book to read them and dive in for yourself and kind of think about the times where you recognize that you fell into that or you saw that as well. And I know within that there's a lot of like, well, isn't that true though? Like, isn't that group this or isn't that group that? And I think that's the portion of becoming anti-racist, is going deeper and understanding that those things that chunk a certain race together with the term is the portion that we have to get out of our minds, because and there's so much out there as far as, this group does this. Well, are Black people lazy, criminals, violent, thugs? Are Jews this? Are Mexicans this? Are white people this? Like, none of those are okay, because we can break it down to a deeper level and really understand where that comes from and how that's very negative and keeps a group marginalized, from race to gender to sexuality and all of those things. And I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but Kendi talks very beautifully about how, we have to fight against all kinds of bigotry. It's not just racism, just because that's the hot topic that we're talking about in, second and third quarter of 2020. We have to fight all kinds of bigotry, because all of that feeds back into defeating and fighting racism. There shouldn't be any marginalized groups. I think we all understand that we want to be equal, we want justice, we want freedom for every single person, and we understand that we want to be equal in those ways. And so when I was reading these definitions of all the different racisms, he talks about biological racism, which is when one expresses the idea that the races are meaningfully different in their biology, and that these differences create a hierarchy of value. Meaning how we're made up, you're born that way, and so you are here on the pecking order. You are here on the hierarchy just based off of your race, because you were born that way. Whenever scientists have debunked that and said that we are 99.9% created the same.
Well, yeah, say that again. 99.9% of all of our DNA is exactly the same.
The same. And so the concept of race is literally man-made, and we're divided because of that. So much learning that can go on in this book. He's so good. The next one, I'm just going to touch on these briefly because time.
Yeah, I'm just going to say something quick about that, if I can.
What'd you say?
I'm going to jump in real quick. And so think of from that genome study. So 99.9% of we are alike with people all over the planet. Think of all the people who are suffering today or hurt today, who've been killed because of that less than 1%. We can do better.
Yep.
We can do better.
And we have to, and we will. I know we will.
The Germans, Hitler was a perfect example of that. That's exactly what he did throughout his whole life.
Yeah, fighting for that 0.1% of how we're different. It's not to a certain race, or even, there's certain differences in ethnicity. That's a different conversation, but races, no. Ethnic racism is one. It's a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequity between racialized ethnic groups and are standardized and are substantiated by racist ideas about racialized ethnic groups. That is another one there, and I'll let you guys kind of just dive into that one because we only have about, I think, 15 minutes before we want to get to questions and answers. Bodily racism is one of the ones that I want to really talk about. The definition is perceiving certain racialized bodies are more animal-like or violent than others. And I know for Black people, and what I've seen a lot from Mexicans as well, kind of what I talked about earlier, is there's certain things that are attached to the Black body. And you see in the news, like Trayvon Martin, for instance, he was killed, and the person got off, was it George Zimmerman, got off because of self-defense, saying that he was defending himself in what I'm looking at, just because that person was Black, because we see this kind of playing out over and over and over. And so what I've seen in my community and kind of in the news is, if you're Black, then you're a weapon. If you're Black, then you're looked at like you could harm someone. How many times, you don't have to shake your head or raise your hand or whatever, but how many times have you saw a Black person and you feared for your life? How many times have you seen a Black person and you switched sides of the street, or you locked your door, or you felt like something could happen to you? I've had the same thing with my own community. So again, it's not, in that moment, it may have been a racist thing, but you're not a racist unless you stay there in that. And that's the thing about the bodily racism that I think is very important that we can debunk and get away from. That is, hey, not every single, 99% of Black people never harm any single person. However, the Black community as a whole is looked at as violent, which just isn't fair. And that goes for any race or any gender or any sex that something is attached to them.
I think that one goes even farther, Isaac, and that a lot of times, in particular, a Black man is seen as like an animal. Mm-hmm. I mean, it even goes to that, that there's something, like you said, inherently intimidating or just scary, and it has to do with the way, there's this perceived way that a Black man looks.
Yeah. Yep. And something, if we go back to Prince Henry, his royal chronicler, or the person who was kind of writing his memoir and documenting and created the term race to separate people, he put in his memoirs that African Americans, or Blacks, not African Americans, Blacks then, were like beasts. They're without any custom of reasonable beings. They had no understanding of good, but only knew how to live in bestial sloth. And that was in 1460. And it's like, that's when that was kind of created. It's like really wild to think that that almost happened 600 years ago. There's cultural racism, there's space racism. Space racism is pretty much like, if you are in a certain space, you belong to a certain space, and if you're outside of that space, then you shouldn't be. Or if you are in a certain space, you must feel, act, and be like that. Mm-hmm. One of those things would be Black people come from and belong in the ghetto or the hood. And if they made it out of that, then they are the special one that made it.
Yeah.
That's not okay.
Yeah.
So again, this is one thing that when all of you read the book, I encourage you to focus on that particular area and all of the different types. That's the part to highlight, and think about yourself and how probably we have all had racist or said racist things or had racist thoughts that follow along all of those different types, the biological, ethnic, bodily, cultural space. So it's just so important to recognize those definitions and where we have probably fallen in with our thoughts. So I'm going to
say one more thing on that.
What? Yes.
And I want to say this because I've had conversations with people, friends, and especially right now with what's going on currently with, we're talking about child trafficking, we're talking about coronavirus, we're talking about race relations, we're talking about all of these things. And I sometimes feel like people only want to pick one cause to get behind, and recognize and know that that isn't how it should be. you can be behind 1, 2, 3, however many causes it takes for there to be justice and equality for every single person, whether you're fighting the fight for eliminating, we talk about minimizing the pay gap for women, eliminating, no gap, equal across the board. Same thing for, Black Lives Matter. Black people want to be equal. We don't want to be superior. Same thing for every single person, realizing that that's what it is to be a good person. How we talk about a lot is it's about right versus wrong. It's not about left versus right, Democrat versus Republican, all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter, and every other duality that there is there. It's about right versus wrong. And so when we're having this conversation, we really need to know what we're fighting for, what we're fighting against, because either we're holding up racist policies or we're trying to dismantle them for anti-racist policies. And multiple fights can be fought at the same time. And if we chunk it together just to say we're doing what's right, it's so much easier than saying, all right now I'm putting on my anti-racism hat. All right, I'm putting on my anti-Semite hat. All right, I'm putting on, which is about doing what's right. And I could beat that to the ground. But
excellent. That sounds like some action steps, Isaac, that we can encourage folks to take.
Yeah.
This is going to come back to you, and we'll probably all jump in on that, on this particular question. This to me is so relevant to today. And when I say today, I don't mean here we are just in just 2020, but actually July 30th of 2020. As you look at things that are going on in Portland, Chicago, other communities around the country. Isaac, what do you think is the difference between a protest and a demonstration? And I'm going to add the term riot. What do you think is an effective way to protest?
So I will say that I had misinformation on the terminology of these, so I'm just going to refer to Kendi's words on this one. And so, when we're talking about protest, demonstration, riot, in his words, he says a demonstration is mobilizing people monetarily to publicize a problem, where a protest is organizing people for a prolonged campaign that forces racist power to change a policy. And I think a lot of times the concept of demonstration and protest are coupled together, like they're the same thing. What I learned through reading this book with Kendi's words is they're different things. A lot of times right now, I was the same thing. I was kind of putting in a lot of what's happening across the country as protests. Well, normally those would be more of a demonstration. You're bringing light to a certain problem that happens without creating a systemic or policy change going forward. However, like Tim was saying, I do think what's happening now with these demonstrations actually are protests, because there are so many changing policies that are happening. Even in Kansas City, we have changed several different policies and enacted things that would get rid of policies and certain things that would marginalize certain communities. And so I think that is really cool. So,
and and that brings me to think about, and this may come up in the Q&A. I think about, I'm a big baseball fan. I think about the very first game of the year, there were then what I would consider then demonstrations of unity that players showed, either by kneeling or Black Lives Matter shirts that they all wore, or the black ribbons. It's easy for a demonstration to then merge into a protest, and probably to go from a protest then go back to a demonstration. I think that they are different things, but they really can easily merge from one thing to another. And so, I think it's important that we pay attention to that. We look at what, NASCAR actually came out with almost like a policy change. So there's some policy things happening in NASCAR, which I would have never thought that NASCAR would be on the cutting edge of trying to, of working toward anti-racist policies. But, I do think it's important that we look at how these organizations that people really, they look to. I have to say it's true that we all still kind of looked at, we those of us who really love sports, we kind of do look to, what's the NFL going to do? with kneeling, you know, at the beginning when the game started, and how they're thinking on Colin Kaepernick has changed some. And so I think, yes, individually, there most certainly are some things happening, but to see now mainstream major organizations taking on demonstrations and in some regards protests, I think is important to note. Tim, is there anything you want to add?
No, I think you got it. You're good.
Hey. All right, we're close. We're down to one last question, and then we have some action steps that we would like to talk with you about, and I'm going to open this up to everyone. So this is a spoiler alert. So if you really don't want a spoiler alert, just close your ears. But I think we've talked about it a little bit. Cancer is a central component to the end of this book. Why do you think Kendi compares racism to cancer? And how can we be courageous in the face of racism? And what's the difference between being courageous and being fearless?
Isaac, you got that, or you want me to jump in?
I think that's you.
So Isaac knows this too. So, and Isaac spoke to this earlier. Really, this book is it's history, it's law, and it's his powerful story. So not only does he tell the story of him waking up to his own racist behaviors, and then talks about his parents, and then talks about his wife, and then in the book he tells a story about his wife was ill, and she developed cancer and got through it. And I'd like to say that was the end of cancer in his life, but it wasn't. And then his mom gets cancer, and she's alive today, and she gets through it. And he's still a young man. He's in his early 30s, I think. He was diagnosed with cancer, stage 4 colon cancer. I don't know if you know much about that illness, but stage 4 colon cancer, the survival rate is really low. It's around 12%. So he went into denial, and he went into shock. By the way, we do a lot of that with racism. We go into denial about it. We don't look at it. We don't talk about it. Good news is he's right now doing well, and cancer's in remission, and hopefully it's not going to come back. But I want to share some of his thoughts and words that actually come from the book. And I want you to listen to these, but not just in your head and in here, but boy, open up your heart space. And this is his own words about the analogy between cancer and racism. He says, "I have cancer, the most serious stage. Cancer is likely to kill me. I can survive cancer against all odds. My society has racism, the most serious stage. Racism is likely to kill my society. My society can survive racism against all odds. It's a long shot, but it's a chance." And then he goes on to say, and I want to share his words because they're just so powerful. "Pain is usually essential to healing, and yet when it comes to healing America of racism, we want to heal America without pain. But without pain, there's no progress." He goes, "We can survive metastatic cancer. We can survive metastatic racism. What if we, from this day forward, what if we connect the two? What if we treat racism as we treat cancer? What if we continue to remove tumors? And what if we continue to focus and remove racist policies? We have to believe, all of us, we have to believe in the possibility that we can strive to be anti-racist from this day forward. We have to believe in the possibility that we can transform our own societies to anti-racist from this day forward." And he says, if we can put our attention onto racism as we do cancer, and actually even do better with cancer, together we can change what the future looks like for our children and grandchildren and for each other. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a great sort of parting shot, Chris. I don't know why I said Chris. Tim, can you talk to the group about action steps before we open it up. You're so good at that. When we were in Leadership Northwest, I would say I almost feel like every meeting that you were at, we had to leave with some sort of a action step or something that we could do. And I want everyone to think about your own action steps. And when we open it up, if you've thought about this already, if you'd like to talk about what some of your action steps are. But Tim, do you have something in particular that you think would be a great action step? Or Isaac, you too?
Yeah, I have some thoughts, and then I'd like to hear what Isaac has to say. So I'm going to use the analogy or the metaphor as racism and multiple types of racism that Isaac shared. Think of those as weeds in your garden. And I'm going to say racism will not end unless we eradicate the weeds. We have to pull the weeds out of the garden, and which is all the racist behavior. I think where it begins first is with our own. It's following what Kendi did. Self-examination. Don't look at other people. Don't even look at other policies until you begin to look at yourself and to be honest with yourself and critical with yourself. And ask yourself, like I ask myself every day now, where am I racist? Where am I anti-racist? And to do our own work first. And then learn what it means to be racist.
Yep.
Stop saying that you're anti-racist, or that you're not racist. I'd like to encourage everybody from this day forward never to say again that you're not racist, because by saying that, it's a passive response, and it doesn't do any good. It just keeps us stuck, and it helps us to remain silent. And then to begin to explore what it means to be anti-racist and to support organizations, whether it's through joining them, through donating them. Donate your time and energy to organizations that eradicate racism. Those are things that we all can do, and continue to have these continuing conversations.
Absolutely. Isaac, anything you'd like to add to that before we open it up?
Yeah, I have a couple things. That was really good, Tim. I think one of the best things that you can do is one that you just said, is that concept of self-examination and really looking inside and like figuring out how you feel about these things. When you're really reading the book and you're reading these different concepts, what resonates? What hits you? Why do you feel that certain way about what you just read? I know the four of us have been doing it, and it's given us a lot of growth as well through this process of understanding how do we get racist ideologies out and start focusing more on the anti-racist ones and put those on a pedestal. So I think that's first. Second, make a dedication to it and know that this is your new way of being. This is your new way of showing up. We can start now with it, or you can just wait and be like, well, I want to learn more. Well, I want to whatever. No, start now, like right now. We have to start now to get this thing going. Take action, like Robin and Tim were saying, and realize how imperative this is and how much as leaders, I mean, most of you came from Leadership Northwest, Missouri, so you guys are leaders, whether it's your family or in your workplace or at church or whatever it is. Like, be ahead of the curve when it comes to this. Like, learn these things now, and so you can better be effective as a leader when you are talking and interacting with your family and your employees or the people in whatever group that you're in. And that goes along with the other one, like the third one, education. I think that you shouldn't educate yourself into the ground where it gives you analysis paralysis and you feel like you're stuck. But education is going to help you along the process. Not so you can win an argument on social media and come up with, well, actually, history says this. That's great. But just so you understand where certain things come from, and you're educating yourself in things that you can fight against. Like, what are some things that I can figure out that I don't know right now? Have those conversations with people and use the #1 resource in the world right now, Google. What are some racist policies? And you're going to get so many lists from people, and you can go through those and kind of learn, okay, why is this racist? What can I learn? What can I pick out and decipher from this? I think that's very, very important as well. And I always put this in when I'm having these kind of talks, is give yourself grace. There is a very high burnout rate on a movement like this because it seems so big. How can I even positively impact it? Well, know that you're not trying to change the whole world, because you can't. Not even someone with a lot of status can do that. But what you can do is you can change your little world that's around you, your friends, your family, your coworkers, etc. But know that it's not going to happen in a day. I mean, 1460 is when Prince Henry put racist ideologies in place and created a racial hierarchy. That was almost 600 years ago. So it's not going to go away just because you decided to dedicate yourself to be an anti-racist. However, you can push the needle forward in your community, in your family. So give yourself grace. You can take a break. Like for me, my weekend is my time to shut off from any kind of work, whether it's racial injustice or it's routine work or whatever it is. And I spend that time doing things that I love, hanging out with my family, hanging out with my wife, my dogs, working on my new house, etc. So really remember that when you're along the journey, that Rome wasn't built in a day, and racism isn't going to be eradicated in a day either.
Excellent.
I've got one last thing to share as an action step. It's tricky to call people out. And matter of fact, I think you need to be careful about how you do that. And so I think there's power in words and language. I like to think of, instead of calling someone out, I like to give them a nudge. And a nudge is like a tap. A nudge usually starts with words like, hey, Isaac, I noticed that you said this, and I'd like to just hear what you think about it. So don't think we have to call people out and to attack people, but we want to call people out, but we're going to do it in ways that are going to be productive. And so think of the word nudge, and we all can give somebody a nudge and just say, hey, I noticed. And then a nudge can lead into a conversation where you can learn more about them and they can learn from you. And it's through these continued conversations that we'll all do better. So.
Okay. So now we're going to open it up to you. My goal was 3:30 for the Q&A section. We're at 3:34, but there's not 4 minutes of this whole conversation we've had so far that I would want to take away. Deb, I believe they can open themselves up for a conversation. Here's what we'll do. There's been some great talk in the group chat. So if some of you who've been involved in the group chat actually want to ask your questions out loud, we can do that. What we're going to do is try to recognize you as you begin to talk, and it may be something that we'll figure out a way to take turns as we go along. But you should be able to unmute yourself, and certainly this is the opportunity for you to comment on the things that we've said, or your own experiences or your own thoughts. So there we go. We're now open for your comments. So someone's got to be first.
And if no one, somebody's got it?
No, I was going to do the Jeopardy theme song.
Well, I guess I had one question.
Oh, here we go. Gina?
You said that we don't have to call people out, which I completely agree with that and understand that. And yet, how does it not appear that we agree? And so somebody mentioned in the chat about, the Germans and Nazi, and they were the ones actually killing the Jews, and there were all of those that allowed it to happen. How does not saying anything, where's that line between not constantly feeling like you're fighting, because that's what it feels like when you're constantly trying to fight this battle against racism. It's exhausting. How do you balance that being kind and yet not standing by?
So thank you. Let me clarify. So I don't want you not to call people out. I want us all to call people out, but it's the way in which we do it is what I want to emphasize. So I can easily call people out that put people in a spot and really points out negativity, but I want us to think about calling people out. I want us to think about the way we do it. So instead of beating them over the head with a baseball bat, which we know doesn't work, it only gets more reaction, but to think of it as a nudge. So it's like a nudge, and nudge starts with, hey, Gina, I noticed you said this. I heard you say this, and I want to learn more about it. So to me, it's about calling them out, but in the way that we call it out, we want to be able to have conversations that engage people. Does that make sense?
Right. I agree with what you're saying. The issue is like, well, if you're in management, you pull somebody aside and you have that conversation with them one-on-one because you're helping them build. But what we're talking about is something that's public, you know, and so balancing that publicly, I want to stand against what I know is wrong, and yet privately, you want to work with somebody, you don't want to attack them. But I think it's that walk of what you do in public so that people understand where you stand. Does that, you understand what I'm saying? What you're talking about is pulling somebody aside and saying, hey friend, you know, let me hear what you think and I'll tell you what I think. But what about in public? How do you do that?
I think it's the same way, Gene. I don't think you even have to know somebody. Like if, let's say, and we do have the benefit of knowing each other. But let's say we didn't know each other, and I'm gonna and so you've said something racist. By the way, most people don't like those conversations in front of other people. But so I do think it's important to choose your battles wisely. But I'm at a point in my life where I'm just not going to remain silent anymore. And I know from times I've remained silent, terrible things have happened to people. Even when I spoke up and stood up for people, I didn't stand up enough and I wasn't loud enough. I will never, ever shrink to make other people more comfortable. So to me, I still want to find ways that people will listen. If I just pick up a baseball bat and start accusing people and saying you're a racist, that's probably the end of the conversation. So I actually am probably going to do what Stephen Covey would say, first seek to understand before asking others to understand you. So I would say, hey, Gina, I heard you say that. I'm curious about where that comes from. Help me to understand better. And I'd probably let you talk for a while. And I would really listen, but I would stay strong and solid on what my beliefs are, and I would go back to using his words, and that's what the new paradigm shift for me is. So to be anti-racist, so like either at the end of the day we support policies and ideas that lead to equality for all people and equity for all people, and if we do the other, it's not racist, it's racist. And so I would teach, but I would listen a lot first. And no, I don't want us to remain silent. I don't want anybody to. Most of you know this, but when I was in grad school at a university, a friend of mine from Nigeria, his name's Wally Morgan, and Isaac, this has to do with bodily racism, and it also has to do with space racism. He lived in a residence hall that was all white guys, and they felt like he did not belong there. And they continued to harass that man until one night they put a 5-gallon bucket of stinky water against his door, knocked on his door, and that water was where somebody had got, the stinky water was vomit from people getting sick and drunk and then cleaning it up over the weekend. And anyway, they leaned that against his door, opened his door, flooded his room. It was a tipping point. He chased the guy down, grabbed the guy, threatened his life. Wally went to jail, and he never came out. He got beat to death in jail, and it was only because he was black. And I stood up, I said things. We didn't have anti-racist policies at that university at that time. And I believe they do now. And if they don't, we all need to make sure that we have policies that protect people. So, and I don't know if, Gina, if I've got off, but so please don't think I don't want you to call people out, but we have to call people out in a way that's going to have a conversation.
And I think the comment in chat, Tim, that really addresses that, Lindsay says, I think that's one of the reasons Kendi suggests fighting racist policies versus trying to target individual people. I know on Facebook it is exhausting, and I know you don't use Facebook a lot, Tim. It is exhausting if we went and tried to have those conversations with everybody that is blatantly racist and try to educate them about what it means to be anti-racist. I think what I may start to try to do, because it makes my blood boil, is maybe try to have a personal conversation with them with logic. Because as soon as you put it out there, they say this and you say this, then it just it stops being a conversation. It stops being civilized. But But Gina, I feel that it's completely different. You're right. When it's somebody, if it was one of my employees or Brian or Jamie or Deanne that we're having a conversation with, and not that they would have any reason for me to call them out, but they might. But it's so much different than like Tim's situation, or you see something in a bar, you see something somewhere, and standing up and being courageous, not fearless, because there's not a lot of fear involved with that. Even getting on Facebook, there's a lot of still fear with saying that, but to be courageous in your interactions of calling people out. So I hope that helps a little bit, because I felt like there's a little bit of, when you say public, some of that social media and some of that truly is public.
When we're in formal leadership roles, I think we have a responsibility to weigh in and let people know where we're at. And if you look around in the media, most Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 100 companies, business and organizations, most of them are making a statement so people don't have to guess. And so hopefully we're working for organizations that get it. And that can also be another way to introduce yourself to that conversation.
Okay. What else? What other questions?
Well, I want to say one other thing. Sorry. So, Gina, I heard you say this, and gosh, I'm exhausted. I have fatigue in a way that I don't know that I've ever had it in my entire life. And most of it's come out of being part of COVID, and just seeing all the suffering that's happening with my Black and friends and colored friends. But I cannot imagine for Isaac, as a Black young man, what it's like everywhere you go to almost feel like you never belong and always have to like gauge yourself whether you fit in. And so like lately I said, like, God, I just don't know. John Lewis, who just died, and most of us know who he is, I don't know how he went to Selma and crossed that bridge so many times and was arrested for good trouble most all of his life. And I can't imagine the level of fatigue and just overwhelm. And so, gosh, I have it. And I'm glad that you mentioned it. And I know you well, and you're such a loving, kind, caring person. And yet, I don't know. I don't think we're going to get out of this work without some of that. So, but knowing that we're in it together helps me. I just wanted to let you know that I heard you say that.
And John Lewis would be proud of the fact that here we are gathered, getting into some good trouble, or at least the start of potentially getting into some good trouble, as he talked about. So,
Right.
what other questions?
I was going to ask Monica's question for the chat earlier, because she asked, but then she had to leave early. I gave her my take on it, but for Isaac or Tim, she wanted to know specifically what was anti-racist around policies regarding needing a government ID to vote. So the one that I mentioned was lower socioeconomic classes. If they can't afford the government ID, they don't have a driver's license. But if Monica, for the recording, could get your guys' take on, or even Robin's, you know, in regards to the fines in the library, on why there are racist portions of that policy of the ID Act to vote.
Yeah, and I don't know, so I'm just assuming, but to my knowledge and limited knowledge, and there may be other people I know that can speak to, but even access to transportation to even have a driver's license. So many of those people don't. We make false assumptions, and we take for granted that people have driver's license and access to driver's license and access to transportation, and that's not true. And even transportation to, so like I'm on the board at Northwest Health Services, and which provides healthcare to residents all over Northwest Missouri. And what we're known for is access for everyone. Well, there's lots of people that they're not going to be able to make it to voting booth, and they surely don't make it to their appointments because of a lack of funding for gas, or so yeah, that's my little bit of thinking on it. I'm sure some of you may even have more knowledge on that than I do.
And
But
I don't know enough about the process, and I should, because part of the office that I work in is,
Robin, so to be anti-racist, what we do is that we would follow up on that question, would learn that answer, and would know that knowledge, and would be able to share that in future discussions. So Kaylee Gibson,
well, like I told her to
do a deep dive on
well,
that.
and I told Yeah, I told Monica one of the ways that I thought that it was specifically applicable was if you look at the lower socioeconomic classes that oftentimes are people of color or Black individuals, and they don't have access to a car or to get a government ID, and they're still living at home. So they, because she then asked, she said, well, what about public assistance? In order to be on government assistance, don't you need a government ID? And I said, well, yes, the parent does, but the 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old kid, which is a very large portion in their late teens, early 20s, in those lower socioeconomic classes, or in, the people of color, or, African American individuals, or Black people, or Hispanic people that are in those classes, oftentimes more than us as Caucasians, they don't have that luxury. Their parents may be on public assistance, but they're not. So maybe they don't have a driver's license. So that means they don't have a government ID, so they can't vote.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's racism right there, right? That's a racist policy. If you are making it so that people of a lower socioeconomic class don't have the means to be able to vote.
And what I'm aware of, I think there's less than 1% of fraud when it comes to voting. So, yeah.
Yeah.
This is Jennifer. I wanted
I
to
don't know,
add in on
Isaac.
the ID issue. I used to work in public libraries in Charlotte, North Carolina, and there were some, not even looking at income, there were some older Black communities and then also Vietnamese communities where they got everything that they needed within a certain area of where they lived. So driving and owning a car was not part of their day-to-day normal existence. So it's getting an ID was also something that they didn't see as a need.
Yep. Yeah, if they don't need it for other aspects of their life, then to have to get it only for voting, that whole process could be very, very daunting. Any other questions? Comments?
What other questions? What other questions, comments, thoughts? What do you struggle with? What will you take away from beginning to learn about Kendi's work, what it means to be an anti-racist? What are your takeaways? What will you do differently because of these last 2 hours? What will you do differently starting today and tomorrow and the next day and next week?
I think my biggest thing is, honestly, and Tim knows this, and Isaac as well, I am a huge analytical thinker. I am a scientist, but I am also a writer, a speaker, and for me, analysis paralysis is a very real thing. And so I decided very early on that I was going to order the 3 or 4 books that I eventually wanted to read. That for right now, my job and my being and staying authentic to me is having one-on-one conversations, group conversations, gaining perspectives from people that grew up completely differently than I did, whether that is politics, race, religion, skin color, ethnicity, cultural background, and working to follow more influencers in that area, any of those areas, but specifically people of color, and amplify their stories and voices because they are the ones living the life on a normal basis. I could have read White Fragility a month ago, but I didn't because it's written by a white author. So instead, I bought books by Black authors and I listened to Black voices and to voices of people of color, because that gives me a heck of a lot more insight than a book that might be a phenomenal book with a phenomenal point to it. But I am supporting the Black businesses that I know, the Black authors that I know of. I'm following people on social media that can give me insight into their daily lives. And then I'm using that to amplify their voice to other people that I talk to on a regular basis. If not, then I have analysis paralysis, right? So I did it the way that I knew I could get things done without going through that analysis paralysis motion.
Kaylee, there's a great Facebook group that is specific to this book. The how to be an anti-racist. If you when you get into Facebook and you can search it, that you can join that group and follow the conversation. So it's gonna be even beyond obviously what we've talked about here. It's a fantastic group to be a part of. And I appreciate you saying that. It's interesting that you brought up White Fragility. We've talked about that being our next book to continue the conversation. And I agree with you that it is important to read the works of on this particular topic from African Americans. White fragility, though, is us talking, us white women, or us, it's a different perspective, but I think it takes what we've learned here and how to be an anti-racist, and does show it from a different perspective, but not, but a perspective that we can still all learn from. And so, that brings me to the fact that we didn't call this continuing the conversation just because it was catchy, and we didn't want this to be a one-off. We want to continue the conversation. We want the 60 some of you who started with us to continue, and more, to continue this conversation. I mean, I think that this is something that we can continue to build on, and it doesn't even have to continue to be on this particular topic. Discussions like this are critical when we see injustice or we see things we want to change. We all have such a different, unique voice, but we all do have to come together and figure out a way that we can make a difference back in our community. So thank you, Kaylee, for
And I think
talking about that.
I'd like to point one more thing out, Robin. I am 100% all for discussions around white fragility. I just, A, the book was sold out on Amazon. B, it was by a white author. And C, I watched tonight. There's a phenomenal 90-minute video where Robin DiAngelo discusses white fragility and what that is. And it is a phenomenal topic to discuss, to reevaluate within yourself the different kinds of fragility, not only as a woman, but as a white woman and a woman in my 30s who grew up in small town Southeast Nebraska. But I just a different book. Because there are free resources. I mean, the library is a great resource. YouTube is a great resource. And so I encourage people to definitely look into that book. And if you don't want to read the book, watch the 90-minute video on that video on YouTube has changed so many lives for the better.
Yeah. I'd like to put my 2 cents in on that when you're done. Sorry.
Got it, Isaac.
No, I was actually going to ask you to tell your story about that video, if you could, without naming names.
Sure. So Kaylee knows this well, and if you follow me on social media, you know this as well, that I love that book and I love that author, and I was very inspired by her. I started as well with a YouTube video by her because I was like, right when everything happened, the first thing that came up was like white fragility, and that was the most sold out book, even more than Kendi's books, because people were trying to understand and gain knowledge. And so I was like, I need to see what this is about before I start referring this to people. So I listened to a video. I was very inspired by her. Then I got the book, and my wife and I read it, and it's great. It's great. So if you don't have a book that you're reading right now, please pick it up, because I do think we're probably going to do it for our next book discussion. Even if we don't, it is just a marvelous book to change your perspective. It opened my eyes. It actually, Tim's got it right there. It actually made me, like convicted in a way where I could also be better in helping others through things that I allowed to happen around me. And so it really helped me a lot. So that's that. Second one I wanted to speak to, what Kaylee and Laura and a lot of people, Jennifer, are talking about in the comments right now about what we can do to take action steps now. And several of you hit on it. I think, in my opinion, one of the most important things that you can do is diversify the voices and the faces around you. And when you do that, when you start interacting with people of the Black community, steer away from what is called cultural racism, of trying to think that they are weird or different because they do things differently than you. That is a big thing that I've heard from my white friends, that they are culture shocked because they're like, oh, I don't like that, or oh, I don't whatever that, or that's weird, different, whatever, that they said that, feeling that, using that word, talking like that. And like, culturally, Black people are different. Just like culturally, Italians are different, and Mexican Americans are different, or Mexicans in general are different. Spanish, Russians, we're all different. But what has happened with this cultural racism is the lighter, fairer skinned friends have been accepted, while the darker friends have been rejected. And the darker your skin gets, the more you're rejected. And so start diversifying your voices. Follow different people than you normally follow on social media. If there's someone in your office that is of color, just start having conversations with them. Please don't tell them to enlighten you, because not every Black person has signed up for that. I have, and I like having these conversations. A lot more Black people have not, but just have conversations, strike it up. And whatever else is in the middle, Black authors, Black music, Black food, whatever that is, and just be open to the experience and understand you're understanding a different race, just like all the time we understand other different races that may look a little more like you, and be okay with that. And if you don't like something, really dive deep into why you don't like that. Were you told you weren't supposed to like that, or do you actually not like it because it goes against your values or something like that? Like for me, I had an Ethiopian restaurant that was close to my house. My wife and I went there. She loved it. I hated it. Doesn't make me culturally racist. It just means that that doesn't sit with my palate. However, what I do like about the Ethiopian people is their how they speak, how they love at a really high level, how they dress. So be open to the experience of it. And also, again, give yourself grace. If you don't like a certain thing, doesn't mean you don't like the people. We can't push away a whole grouping of people because of one thing. So that's my 2 cents. Get diversified in who is around you and enjoy the experience, and realize we're not all supposed to be the same, and which is a form of assimilation. Realize that we are different, and that's okay. And learn and grow.
Yay. Which we've done for sure. I think we have time for one more
I
question.
think Tim has something.
I want to share a thought if I can.
Okay.
Sorry. So, and actually it comes from, I just opened up the chat and I'm reading all the different things that all the participants put in there. And I believe life is a collaboration. People need people. We don't go through life alone. We can't go through it alone. And we just have to open ourselves up to learning. We have to open ourselves up to not knowing. We have to heighten our awareness to make certain things detectable and tangible. You just, like Celeste, I love what you wrote about all those different examples of microaggressions. We see those and hear those every day wherever we go. And thanks for reminding me, and I'm going to say all your classmates in here today, like, pay attention to those things. And if you're ever guilty of saying those things, just heighten your awareness to stop it and to replace it with something different. There's nothing wrong with not knowing this or not getting this right, but boy, we have to be open to learning. And there were so many good comments in this chat that you guys have contributed to that all could be turned into action steps. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. Together, we will continue to become anti-racist and move forward, creating a free and equitable world for all people. And it's people like you that give me hope, and I'm sure that give Kendi hope. So thank you all for what you do. Thank you more for who you are.
Inspired that you guys are here, open-hearted.
Yes. So you will all be invited, just by the fact that you were here. You'll be invited to, as we continue the conversation. We have to regroup, as the 4 of us have to regroup. I feel pretty positive it is going to be white fragility. I think we kind of had determined that. And we will figure out what time we want to do that, do something very similar as far as the format goes. The recording will be available. We'll make sure you get it sent to you so that you can use it however you want to use it. The chat will be included. We'll also put it on the, probably in social media and on the website for Leadership Northwest. I'm talking for you, Deb. But we are thrilled that y'all turned in with us this afternoon, and we are very much looking forward to continuing the conversation. How many times have I been able to throw that catchphrase in? And appreciate each and every one of you for participating and adding to the conversation in whatever way that you were able to add to the conversation. So Deb, what am I missing? What do we need? What else do we need to tell the group before we adjourn?
I think you covered it, Robin. Again, we will send out the link for today's chat, and I'll send information on all of our presenters today. Let's give them a big thumbs up for today. What a great conversation we've had. Really appreciate Robin, your facilitation, and Isaac and Tim in your presentation today. And so, having said that, I think I'd like to end by saying something that Isaac said earlier, which really resonated with me. We know this is difficult. We're all trying to learn. We're collaborating. We're having the conversations. But Isaac said, give yourself grace. And I think that's what we need to do moving forward, and just keep reaching out to others and learning. That's the best we can do. So
I think one thing we can do, Deb, is we can hang out in the room for a little while in case anyone has something specific that they would like to ask, unless the rest of you need to leave immediately. But I'm okay to hang out in the room until all of the questions are answered, and we will be in touch as soon as we can. So
sounds good.
Guys, that was awesome. That was so good. I'm so glad you recorded that.
Thank you, Kaylee.
You guys have a great day.
We are selfish, and I think all four of us can say that the planning of this, the conversations that the four of us have had together, that immediate, like, we're going to do this, and how we've got from there to where we are now has been fantastic. Leadership Northwest class of 2013, our team motto was Team Synergy. And as you all know what that means, we all bring something individual. We're all better as a group because of the individual things that we bring to any sort of discussion or project. So thank you, Team Synergy, for being a part of this.
And really thank all of you for being champions for anti-racist ideas and policies. I want you to practice saying this. I am anti-racist.
And I like myself.
Yeah, thank you.
Love it.
I'm going to take off. Apparently our creek is flooding all throughout the HOA, so I'm going to go check that out.
It's been
Yeah,
pouring.
I've gotten texts from, like, neighbors with
Nice to
literal
meet you,
rivers.
Kaylee.
Huh?
Nice to meet you.
You too, Robin. I was glad that you were one of the facilitators. I first heard of you on the alumni call when you were there.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, I need to get to know her because I'm like one of the most avid readers that you're ever going to meet in your life.
Good.
So,